Now, is a new axis of evil forming between Russia and China? That's the question Western leaders have been pondering after Xi Jinping joined Vladimir Putin in Moscow to discuss relations between the two nations, as well as the conflict in Ukraine.
The Chinese Premier's visit to Russia came days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin on war crimes allegations.
We're joined now by chief foreign commentator for the newspaper, Micheal Day. Well, I've been reading this and following it closely, and I'm wondering, is there something here that we need to be aware of, alert of, concerned about, this axis of evil?
Good morning. Well, clearly there is an alliance between Russia and China, and it's based on the fact that it's an opposition to the West, I think. They're fed up with Western power. China, in particular, is angered and frightened by the ability of the Westers to launch sanctions against it. So there clearly is an alliance. And it's the fact that China's tacit support for the war in Ukraine has clearly focused our attention on it, I think.
Michael, is it an axis of evil? Is it just an axis of convenience? What is it that each wants from the other?
Well, I'm not going to use the word evil. That's for people to decide themselves. It's a partnership of convenience, certainly. Russia is very, very isolated at the moment. I mean, most of the world is horrified by its barbaric war on Ukraine. China, however, sees Russia as a useful partner in opposing the West, in opposing Western dominance of the world. So it doesn't care about how many people Ukraine and Russia kills in Ukraine. It's not bothered. Don't forget, China is a country that's got 1 million Uyghurs locked up in concentration camps. It's not really bothered about human rights. It's all about, opposing the West. I think what China, in the long term, what China would like to do, of course, is replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency, because don't forget, American power, it's not about its navy, it's not about its nuclear arsenal, it's about its ability to slap sanctions on virtually any company in the world, because the US dollar accounts for 60% of the world's reserve currencies. And so there are all sorts of plans afoot, digital currencies, perhaps promoting the Chinese renminbi, its own currency, to replace it. But that's going to take a very long time to happen.
Michael,
so in the media,
is it sensible for the Chinese to be closely associating themselves with somebody where there's somebody who's an international pariah, where there's in effect a warrant out for their arrest to go before the international criminal courts? I mean, it seems quite a dangerous strategy for a big country that's wanting to maximise its influence around the world to do that.
It is. I mean, this week we saw this so-called peace initiative on the part of Xi Jinping when he was in Russia. He announced a peace plan, and that was shot down in flames pretty quickly, wasn't it? It coincides with the Chinese, I think, this global security initiative. And if you look at that, the second main point in this security initiative is for calling on the world to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, in brackets, except Ukraine, clearly. So that was shot down in flames by most of the world. And we heard just before this meeting in Moscow that Xi Jinping might actually be meeting President Zelensky. Now, because I think Zelensky suggested this, there's no sign of it so far. If he doesn't meet Zelensky, then China trying to promote itself as trying to bring peace will look completely hollow. And there's no sign of this phone call between Zelensky and Xi yet. He seems to be running scared, I think.
But looking at it from another angle, I'm quite sure China would want peace as such. They need to sell their goods. They need the world not spending out and concerned with other things, with the cost of living crisis. They are looking for domination of their products around the world. Is this what could really be the motivation behind the peace process?
No, that's a good point. I mean, because of course the Chinese economy has its own problems at the moment. There's a property crisis. We had the ridiculous zero COVID policy, which was a disaster. There are trade sanctions. There was a trade war. There are still trade barriers up in place. And I think the failed peace initiative this week was partly to try and bring Europe on board a bit more, soften relations with Europe, because China is desperate. It might not like the West, but it desperately needs to trade with us. And it's already, relations with the US are practically in a deep freeze. The last thing it wants is to completely cut off relations with the other great trading bloc of the world, the EU. And so you're right, the war is not doing China any favors. But at the same time, I think Xi has kind of staked his reputation with Putin on Russia not losing. So he's between a rock and a hard place, I think.
Michael,
and in the meantime, the war goes on and people are suffering.
We've got to get to the news, but just very quickly, if you could, there have been reports of the UK supplying depleted uranium shells to the Ukraine. How serious an escalation would that be if that were to happen, do you think?
I don't think it will be. I don't think it is. I think what we ought to be doing is giving Ukraine everything it needs to finish this war. See, we keep talking about these red lines. I think these red lines, first it was medium distance missiles, then it was tanks, and we keep crossing these supposed red lines. The red lines are things that we invent in our minds and Putin encourages, so we don't give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself. I mean, I think we need to hopefully to get this conflict finished within 2 years before we have someone like DeSantis or Trump in the White House. I don't know what would happen there, but it wouldn't be pretty.
Michael Day. We said it together.
Stereo.
Michael Day, thank you very much indeed.